Messages you send out of desperation, not the subtle stories you post hoping they'll see, and definitely not pretending you're okay while you're falling apart inside. The truth is, the more you try to pull them back, the further you push them away. What really changes everything is surprisingly simple. It's when you stop. Stop explaining, stop proving, stop trying to make them understand you. Because from the beginning, if they truly wanted to understand, they wouldn't have chosen to leave the way they did. There's a very important moment that most people miss, the moment you realize you don't have to do anything more to make someone stay. And that exact moment is when you start taking your power back. The irony is, when you're no longer trying to get them back, that's when they begin to look back. Not because you changed them, but because you finally stopped losing yourself. And from this point on, the story is no longer about how to make them regret, but about how to become someone whose absence is not something they can easily forget. After you stop, the next step isn't to do something to get their attention. It's to disappear in a way they can no longer control. Not the kind of disappearance driven by anger or hurt, but a conscious withdrawal, where you no longer exist in their life in any form. You don't text, you don't view their stories, you don't leave behind even the smallest sign that you're still watching. And this may sound simple, but it's actually the hardest thing to do, because it forces you to face the emptiness they left behind instead of trying to fill it with attention. But that emptiness is exactly what begins to make them feel. When you were always there, they got used to your presence as something guaranteed. But when you're no longer there, their mind starts searching, starts questioning, starts noticing the absence they never had to confront before. And here's the paradox. The quieter you become, the louder you are in their mind. Not because you're trying to create an effect, but because you've stopped feeding energy into a connection that was no longer balanced. This disappearance isn't a strategy to make them come back. It's the first step in reclaiming yourself. And at the same time, it's when they begin to realize that some things, once lost, aren't always something you can find again the way they used to be. But there's something more subtle that many people don't realize. You may have disappeared from their life, yet you're still keeping them alive in every conversation you have. You talk about them with friends, revisit what happened, analyze every detail, question who was right or wrong. And in doing that, you're still maintaining a connection with them, just in an invisible way. The problem is, every time you do this, you're not only keeping them in your mind, you're also unintentionally giving them a place they no longer deserve. You may have stopped texting them, but if they're still the main subject of your thoughts and your words, then you haven't truly left. And this is what keeps you stuck, not in the relationship, but in an older version of yourself. What you need to do isn't force yourself to forget, but to stop feeding their presence in your current life. Talk about them less, analyze less, try to understand less. Because some stories don't need a perfect explanation to end. They just need you to stop going back and rereading them every day. And when you can do that, you're not just freeing yourself, you're finally stepping out of their influence completely for the first time. Once you've truly pulled yourself away from them, both externally and internally, a space will appear. And this is where everything begins to shift, but not in the way you once expected. Instead of using that space to reminisce, regret, or wonder, what if, you start using it to rebuild yourself. Quietly, without needing to prove anything to anyone, just small but consistent steps, you take care of your body again, reorganize your life, return to the things that once made you feel valuable before that relationship ever existed. And what matters is, you're not doing this for them to see. You're doing it because you finally realized that your worth should never be determined by whether someone chooses to stay or leave. At first, your motivation might still carry a trace of, I need to become better so they'll regret it. But over time, that fades, making room for something more lasting. Self-respect. And it's this quiet transformation that creates the biggest difference. Because if one day they happen to look back, they won't see the same version of you who was once vulnerable, who tried to hold on to them at any cost, but someone who has moved much further ahead, calmer, steadier, and no longer revolving around them. And sometimes, it's in that exact moment that they begin to wonder what they lost, and whether there's still a chance to return to someone who is no longer standing where they left them. And then comes a very strange phase, where you're no longer trying to prove anything, yet the way you show up changes completely. You become hard to reach in the most natural way. Not because you're trying to act cold or distant, but because you're no longer available for just anyone to enter your life as easily as before. You don't respond immediately just because you can. You don't agree to meet just because they want to, and you no longer adjust your emotions to match their presence. A new boundary forms, not to push people away, but to protect what took you so long to rebuild. And that boundary creates a difference that the person who once left can clearly feel. Before, they could come back at any time and find you still there, still available, still familiar. But now, things aren't the same anymore. You're no longer an easy option, and that forces them to see you in a different light. Not as someone who will always be there, but as someone they may have lost. The irony is, you're not trying to create this effect at all, but the moment you stop trying to hold on to them is exactly when your value becomes clearer than ever. And sometimes, it's this no longer easy to reach version of you that makes them start wanting to come back. Not because you changed to fit them, but because you finally stopped shrinking yourself to fit a relationship that was no longer meant for you. And then, after all those changes, you enter a state you once never thought you could reach. You no longer need them to come back. Not in a way that sounds strong or reassuring, but a real release where you realize your life is still full, still meaningful, even without them in it. You no longer check your phone waiting for a message, no longer imagine running into them again, and you don't ask yourself, what if they come back someday? And it's at this point that a paradox begins to appear. When you truly no longer need them, that's when the chance of them coming back becomes the highest. Not because you're playing any psychological game, but because your energy has completely shifted from lack to abundance, from attachment to freedom. Other people can feel that, especially the one who once left, because they were used to a version of you who was always there, always waiting, always open. But now, that door is no longer left open. And if they do come back, they're no longer returning to someone who needs them, but to someone who has learned how to live well without them. And this is the real point. The goal was never to make them regret it, but to bring you to a place where, whether they come back or not, you never lose yourself again. In the end, what you realize isn't how to make them regret it, but that you've outgrown the need to be chosen by someone who once walked away from you. You no longer see this story as a loss, but as a turning point where you were forced to grow, to reevaluate your worth, and to learn not to give it away unconditionally to just anyone again. There may come a day when they return, carrying regret, explanations, or a different version of themselves. But by then, everything has changed, not because you've become cold, but because you've become clear. You're no longer pulled back into old emotions, no longer quick to believe words that aren't backed by action, and more importantly, you're no longer willing to go back just because of memories. Because you understand that what you deserve isn't a delayed return, but someone who chose to stay from the beginning. And if they don't come back, it no longer holds the same meaning it once did. You don't lack them. You were just used to having them. That difference is small, but it changes everything about how you see things. And from here, the story no longer revolves around them, but returns to where it belongs. Around you, your life, and the person you are becoming. Someone who doesn't need anyone to regret leaving because you've learned how to become someone you wouldn't want to lose yourself.